Chicago, 1895. The factory floor trembled under the rhythm of stamping presses. Steam drifted through tall windows and settled on rows of unfinished steel frames hanging from overhead rails. The smell of oil and hot metal clung to the air. Every few seconds, sparks burst into bright flashes as welders fused tubes together, building machines that promised movement in a rapidly changing world. At the center of it all stood a quiet, methodical engineer named Ignaz Schwinn. He wasn't a salesman or a showman, he was a craftsman, a German immigrant who had arrived in America just a few years earlier with a toolbox, engineering drawings, and an obsession with a new invention sweeping across Europe, the safety bicycle. Before this design, bicycles were dangerous machines with massive front wheels known as penny farthings. Riders sat high above the ground, and a single bump could send them flipping forward. The new safety bicycle changed everything. 2 equal wheels, chain drive, pneumatic tires. It was faster, safer, and suddenly accessible to ordinary people. Ignaz saw the future immediately. He arrived in Chicago at the perfect moment. The city was booming after the Great Fire, rebuilding itself with steel, ambition, and relentless energy. Factories were rising in every direction. New industries were being born almost overnight. It was the ideal environment for someone who believed machines could shape the future. In 1895, he partnered with businessman Adolf Arnold to form Arnold and Schwinn Company. Arnold brought capital. Ignaz brought an uncompromising philosophy. Build the best bicycle anyone had ever seen, no matter the cost. Inside the factory, quality became an obsession. Ignaz walked the floor constantly, inspecting welds, spinning wheels, testing bearings with his own hands. Frames were electro-forged, so the joints became stronger than the steel tubes themselves. Parts were overbuilt, reinforced, and tested beyond what most riders would ever demand. While competitors rushed cheap bicycles onto the market to profit from the booming craze, Ignaz refused to cut corners. He believed a machine reflected the character of the man who built it. Then the boom collapsed. By the early 1900s, the bicycle craze burst like a bubble. Hundreds of manufacturers vanished almost overnight. Warehouses filled with unsold inventory. Factories closed. Investors fled. But when the dust settled, one company was still standing. Customers who had been burned by flimsy bikes began searching for something reliable, something that lasted. They turned to the name they trusted most. Schwinn survived because its machines refused to break. Ignaz bought out his partner, took full control, and began expanding the company into a true industrial empire. The factory grew louder, the production lines grew longer, and the Schwinn name slowly became synonymous with durability. Success followed him home. On Humboldt Boulevard, Ignaz built a massive stone mansion that mirrored the philosophy of his bicycles. Heavy, serious, built to last forever. Inside its dark wood halls, discipline ruled just as strictly as it did on the factory floor. Dinner conversations revolved around steel, efficiency, and production. His son Frank was raised to inherit not just the business, but the mindset behind it. Durability became more than a design choice. It became the family religion. And hidden inside that belief was the first quiet flaw that one day would bring the entire empire down. Strength was slowly becoming dogma.
In Europe, the sound of bicycle manufacturing was changing.
Instead of the heavy thud of thick steel tubes hitting workbenches, workshops echoed with the lighter ring of thin metal being shaped into narrow frames. Mechanics worked with aluminum alloys and precision gears, building machines designed not for durability alone, but for speed and efficiency. The difference was immediately visible. European bicycles looked delicate, almost fragile. But when riders climbed hills or raced across long distances, these machines moved with a grace and effortlessness that heavy American bikes simply couldn't match. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, these lightweight bicycles began appearing in the United States. Slender frames, drop handlebars, complex gear systems that let riders glide up inclines instead of grinding their way uphill. Inside the Schwinn offices in Chicago, the reaction was dismissive. Executives looked at the thin tubing and narrow tires and laughed. They called them toys. They believed American riders would never trust machines that looked so fragile. To the leadership, durability still meant weight, and weight still meant quality. So instead of reinventing their engineering philosophy, they chose a safer path. They decided to imitate the appearance of European bikes without changing the foundation underneath. The result was the Schwinn Varsity. On the surface, it looked modern. Drop handlebars, 10-speed gearing, a silhouette that echoed the sleek racers coming from overseas. But beneath the paint and branding, the philosophy remained unchanged. The Varsity was still built from heavy electro-forged steel. It weighed nearly twice as much as the bikes it was meant to compete with. And yet it became a massive success. Thanks to Schwinn's powerful dealer network and trusted reputation, the Varsity sold in enormous numbers. For millions of Americans, it became their first racing-style bicycle. Sales climbed, profits followed. Inside the company, the results felt like validation. The market had spoken, or so they believed. What they didn't realize was that success was quietly teaching them the wrong lesson. Instead of seeing the Varsity as a temporary bridge toward new technology, leadership saw it as proof that their original philosophy was still correct. They believed customers didn't really want lighter bikes. They just wanted bikes that looked modern while keeping the familiar Schwinn strength. Confidence hardened further. Then, in the 1960s, another cultural phenomenon arrived to reinforce that belief. The Stingray. With its banana seat and high-rise handlebars, it became a sensation among American kids. Sales surged once again. The company celebrated another victory. But these wins were built on style and nostalgia, not engineering progress. And while Schwinn celebrated, a completely new kind of cycling was quietly being invented far from the Chicago factory. It wasn't happening on paved roads. It was happening in the dirt. In the 1970s, far from the steel and soot of Chicago, a different kind of bicycle workshop began to take shape in the hills of Marin County, California. There were no factory presses, no assembly lines, no chrome tanks or polished showrooms, just dusty fire roads winding down the slopes of Mount Tamalpais, and a group of riders obsessed with speed, danger, and gravity. They weren't interested in smooth pavement. They wanted to race downhill through loose gravel, sharp turns, and rocky trails. And the bicycles available at the time simply weren't built for it. So they started building their own. In garages and small workshops, riders scavenged old bicycles from junkyards and second-hand shops. They stripped off fenders and lights. They bolted on motorcycle brake levers. They widened handlebars. They reinforced frames to survive violent descents down mountain trails. And almost by accident, a pattern began to emerge. The bikes that worked best were old,
heavy Schwinn frames from the 1930s and 40s. The very machines Ignaz Schwinn had designed decades earlier, built with thick steel and over-engineered strength, turned out to be perfect for this new kind of riding. Riders called their creations clunkers, but they were strong enough to survive punishment no road bike ever could. Without realizing it, a new sport was being born: mountain biking. This should have been the moment Schwinn dominated the future. The geometry, the strength, the durability, it all traced back to their own history. All the company needed to do was notice what was happening and bring the idea into the factory. Engineers inside Schwinn did notice. Some pushed for development of a factory-built mountain bike. They saw the potential. They saw the growing community. They saw a new market forming in real time. But the decision-makers in Chicago saw something else. They saw dirt. They saw fat tires. They saw a bicycle that looked rough, unconventional, and completely different from the polished image the brand had spent decades building. The leadership dismissed the idea. They believed no serious customer would want such an ugly machine. It didn't fit the Schwinn image. It didn't match the legacy. It didn't feel refined. So the company chose to ignore it. While Schwinn looked away, smaller companies stepped forward. Brands founded by riders who had grown up admiring Schwinn bicycles began producing factory-built mountain bikes using lightweight materials and modern components. Within a few short years, the mountain bike exploded into one of the fastest-growing segments of the cycling industry. By the time Schwinn finally recognized what was happening, the market had already been claimed. The revolution they could have led was now being driven by their former admirers. And back in Chicago, the factory that once defined the industry was beginning to show its age.
By the early 1980s, the sound inside the Chicago factory had changed. The rhythm was still there, but it felt heavier, slower. Machines that had once moved with confidence now groaned through each shift. Layers of soot coated the walls from decades of welding and grinding. Paint chipped from aging equipment. Conveyor chains rattled unevenly as if the entire building were tired. This factory had once been the beating heart of the American bicycle industry. Now it felt like a relic struggling to keep up with the pace of the modern world. For generations, the relationship between the Schwinn family and their workers had been unusually strong. Ignaz had walked the floor, spoken with employees, and treated craftsmanship as the soul of the company. The welders, machinists, and assemblers weren't just labor. They were the hands that shaped the brand's identity. But leadership had changed. By the time Edward Schwinn Jr. took control, the distance between the executive offices and the factory floor had grown wider than ever. Decisions were made far from the noise of machinery and the heat of welding torches. The people who built the bicycles felt increasingly invisible. Tension built slowly. Then it snapped. In 1980, the workers went on strike. The picket lines formed outside the factory gates. Signs replaced toolboxes. The familiar morning rush of employees entering the building was replaced by silence and confrontation. For months, production stalled while negotiations dragged on. To the workers, the strike was a fight for survival. To leadership, it felt like betrayal. Instead of seeing the conflict as a warning sign, the company made a decision that would change everything. Executives began to believe the factory itself was the problem. Labor costs were rising. Competition was growing. The old Chicago plant looked expensive and outdated. For the first time in the company's history, the idea emerged that Schwinn might not need its own factory at all. In 1983, the Chicago plant closed. The welding torches went dark. Assembly lines stopped moving. The building that had produced millions of bicycles fell silent. Skilled craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting their trade were suddenly gone from the process entirely. Leadership believed the brand name was strong enough to survive without the hands that had built it. It felt like a smart financial decision, a modern solution to an old problem. But the decision that followed would prove far more dangerous than anyone realized. With the Chicago factory closed, Schwinn faced a new reality. The machines were gone, the workers were gone, but demand still existed, and bicycles still needed to be built somewhere. Leadership began searching for a solution that promised lower costs and faster production. Their search led them across the Pacific. In Taiwan, a small and relatively unknown manufacturer was struggling to grow. The company was called Giant. At the time, it had no global recognition and little influence outside the region. To Schwinn executives, it looked like the perfect partner, a factory that could produce bicycles cheaply while the Schwinn name continued to drive sales. The deal seemed simple. Schwinn would provide designs, engineering expertise, and steady orders. Giant would handle manufacturing. It felt like a clever evolution of the business model. The company no longer needed expensive American factories or union negotiations. Production costs dropped quickly. Profit margins improved. On paper, the decision looked brilliant. But something subtle began happening inside the Taiwanese factories. Workers studied the blueprints carefully. Engineers learned the production methods that Schwinn had spent decades refining. Frame construction techniques, quality standards, manufacturing workflows. Knowledge that had once lived inside the Chicago plant was now being transferred across an ocean. Year after year, Giant improved. They refined processes, increased efficiency, experimented with lighter materials and modern designs, and because they were building bikes for Schwinn, they were learning exactly what the global market expected from a high-quality bicycle. Slowly, the student became stronger. By the late 1980s, Giant no longer needed Schwinn to survive. They had the technology, the experience, and the manufacturing scale to launch their own brand. And when they did, they entered the market with bikes that were lighter, more modern, and often cheaper than the ones carrying the Schwinn name. Without realizing it, Schwinn had trained a competitor capable of replacing them. The company that once controlled every part of the production process was now reduced to a logo placed on bicycles built by someone else. Desperate to regain independence, Schwinn attempted to open a new factory in Greenville, Mississippi. It was meant to mark a return to American manufacturing, a fresh start. Instead, it became another setback. The workforce was inexperienced, quality control struggled, bikes rolled off the line with misaligned frames and peeling paint. The company built on precision and durability was now fighting to maintain basic standards. Confidence turned into panic. By the early 1990s, the numbers told a story that could no longer be ignored. By the early 1990s, the numbers no longer whispered, they shouted. Sales were falling, debt was rising. The bicycle market had transformed into something the company barely recognized. Lightweight road bikes dominated performance cycling. Mountain bikes ruled recreational riding. New brands led innovation, and the Schwinn name, once the center of the industry, had become a fading echo of its former power. Inside offices that had once celebrated growth and expansion, conversations turned quiet and tense.
Financial reports replaced product launches. Meetings focused on survival instead of strategy. For decades, the company had relied on its past momentum. Now that momentum was gone. In 1992, the unthinkable happened. Schwinn filed for bankruptcy. For many Americans, the news felt surreal. This was the brand that had survived world wars and economic collapse, the company that had defined childhood for generations. The idea that it could fail felt almost impossible to accept. But the math was unforgiving. The debts were too large. The market had moved too far ahead. The company that once controlled the road no longer controlled its own future. The final chapter unfolded in a federal courtroom in Chicago in January 1993. There were no machines here, no sparks, no steel, no assembly lines, just quiet voices, legal documents, and the echo of footsteps across polished floors. Members of the Schwinn family sat at a long table while lawyers finalized the sale of the company their ancestors had built from the ground up. With a few signatures, nearly a century of family ownership ended. The business was sold to an investment group for a fraction of its former value. Control passed out of the family's hands. The dynasty that once shaped an entire industry walked out of the courtroom as spectators. The chain that began in a smoky Chicago factory in 1895 had finally snapped. But the story didn't end with the bankruptcy, because the name itself would live on, in a form its founder would barely recognize.
Today, the old mansion on Humboldt Boulevard still stands in Chicago. Its stone walls remain solid. Its structure is unchanged. It was built the same way the bicycles once were: heavy, deliberate, meant to outlast generations. If you stand in front of it, you can almost imagine the conversations that once echoed inside: steel quality, production numbers, the certainty that strength alone guaranteed survival. But the world outside that house changed. The Schwinn name still exists, stamped onto bicycles sold in department stores and online marketplaces. They are lighter now, mass-produced, built in vast overseas factories that operate at global scale. To most buyers, it's just another brand on a crowded shelf. The soul of the original machine, the overbuilt frames, the factory floor inspections, the belief that every weld reflected a craftsman's pride, belonged to a different era. And that is what makes this story matter. Schwinn did not collapse because it built poor bicycles. It collapsed because it stopped adapting. The very philosophy that once made the company unbeatable, rigidity, control, unwavering belief in its own superiority, slowly turned into a barrier. The market evolved, technology shifted, riders demanded lighter, faster, more versatile machines, and instead of shifting gears, the company held steady. In cycling, balance depends on forward motion. If you stop pedaling, gravity takes over. Ignaz Schwinn understood that instinctively when he stepped onto the Chicago factory floor in the 1900s. He believed in movement, mechanical, economic, personal. But over time, the company built on motion became anchored to its own legacy. And legacy is heavy. The rise of lightweight engineering, the explosion of mountain biking, the globalization of manufacturing, all of it reshaped the industry. Brands that embraced change thrived. Those that resisted became nostalgic footnotes. Schwinn became one of them. Yet its impact is impossible to erase. Generations learned to ride on those frames. Entire industries grew from experiments built on old Schwinn steel. Even the mountain bike revolution, born in California dirt, began on the geometry of Schwinn designs. The empire fell. The factories closed. The family lost control.
but the influence remains embedded in the cycling world. The story of Schwinn is not just about bankruptcy. It's about the difference between durability and flexibility, between strength and evolution, between building something that lasts and building something that adapts. And this wasn't the only American brand that mistook dominance for permanence, because sometimes the most powerful companies don't collapse in an explosion. They simply fail to turn while the world rides past them.